Hello everyone and welcome to another video. Now today we're revisiting the RTX 3060 Ti. First launched in December 2020. Availability, well, it just wasn't there in a lot of regions, and when it was, it didn't stay in stock very long. I could never find one. I don't think I got sent a review sample at the time, and now of course it's widely available on the used market, but is it still a good choice? Now the version I have here is the original spec AG DDR6 variant. This is an AFOX card, basically matches the spec of the Nvidia Founders Edition. This was very much sort of reviewed as a 1440p GPU, and some people even tested it with 4K. You know, it was also capable of that, albeit at reduced settings. Now I've decided to stick with 1440p in today's video to see if it's still capable of running games at this native resolution. There's no cheating involved today, no upscaling, anything like that. DLSS and FSR are both off the table. This is pure native 1440p performance. We'll start with ray tracing and Cyberpunk 2077, because if you want to enable ray tracing, especially the higher presets in games at native 1440p, then the 3060 Ti is going to struggle, not only because of the VRAM, most of which is being utilised here, but just the power that the card offers anyway. This is not ideal, so you are going to have to play around with some upscaling options or lower resolution ones, but of course the focus of today's one is mainly 1440p performance. So let's move on for now. We'll come back to Cyberpunk 2077 and jump into the Apex Legends result. So I've sort of guessed the settings that I wanted to use today in order to try and hit at least 60 FPS with decent visuals as well. I didn't think this would be a problem for Apex Legends. I went with the high textures and everything else set to its respective highest, and TSAA for the anti-aliasing. As you can see, no issues here. The performance was absolutely fine. We could have cranked the texture quality up even higher, to be honest. I'm using this card in a smaller form factor case, so you may see temperatures higher than what you're used to in other 3060 Ti benchmarks, getting up towards 80 degrees. That's not quite a problem yet, however. I also have it paired with a 14900K, which isn't known for its cool or efficient operation, to say the least, but I actually have it limited to 125 watts today, and I can run this on an air cooler and it will hit its maximum boost clock. But today isn't about that. Today is about the card, and as you can see here for our first result, I'm just running about all over the place, sliding around, looking for some enemy players, of which there don't seem to be many, and we are seeing a very nice frame rate. But this was always going to run well on the 3060 Ti, so let's get into something a bit more demanding. For Alan Wake 2 and the graphical options, we have 2560 by 1440. Of course, everything has been set to its respective lowest. Reason being is that if we go with the medium preset, then it will turn a few things up, and we will see a lot more dips and drops below 60. We're not really getting any of that with the lowest preset, and in my opinion, the game still looks pretty good. Now, of course, I'm not saying you have to play like this, and realistically, you may choose to enable a few upscaling techniques, drop the resolution perhaps in order to make use of higher visual quality settings, but because this card was featured as a sort of 1440p GPU in a lot of reviews, I thought we'd stick with that today just to see how well it does 4 years on. And even in Alan Wake 2, which is known to be quite demanding, I am quite impressed with how it's doing, and we're not using that much VRAM, not as much as I anticipated. I was expecting the whole 8GB to be immediately assigned and used up in a matter of minutes, but everything's okay here thus far. Next up we have Baldur's Gate 3, once again, of course, 2560 by 1440, DLSS, FSR1 and FSR 2.2 are turned off. The preset says custom, but it's basically the high preset, albeit with depth of field turned off, because, you know me, if you've watched my videos, you'll know that I find depth of field and motion blur absolutely horrible. We also have TAA turned on as our form of anti-aliasing, and we are hitting at least 60 frames per second in and around the city here. Ultra will still manage this, albeit with a few more dips and drops to the mid-50s, low 40s. A slight drop there, below 60 frames per second, but it doesn't really affect our averages that much. I think this is basically pushed as far as I'd like to go in order to retain 60 FPS most of the time within this game. High preset is absolutely fine with Vulkan. By the way, the Vulkan API, we also have DX to select as well if we want to. Vulkan generally, in my experience, provides a slightly smoother result, or at least it does here, so that's worth bearing in mind, but it's of course worth testing out for yourselves too. Black Myth Wukong next, 1080, no, not 1080p, 1440p. You'd think by now I'd be used to saying that because this is a 1440p benchmark video. Super resolution set to 100%. Now this is quite the tough one. As you can see, we have everything set to the low settings, basically the lowest settings. I did start off with medium and I thought that would be absolutely fine, but as soon as we got anywhere near water, this is where the frame rate dropped. I mean, you could be near water and lose like 10 frames per second off the average, and you can probably see that happening here as well. Although we have set everything to its lowest, the water does still severely impact our frame rate. I haven't got very far into this game, as you can see, but yeah, I'm enjoying what I have played so far. The whole 10 minutes or so that I've played of this game seems to be running fine on the 3060 Ti at 1440p with the lowest settings. The i9 is just chilling out and using just like 10% of its power, not really hard on the CPU at all. Let's just wipe out a couple of these fellas, make sure that the frame rate sticks to above 60 FPS, which it's doing. We'll take some of that stuff and run this way. I cannot remember this checkpoint at all. I'm not even sure if I'm going the right way, but what I can tell you is that performance at 1440p for the 3060 Ti seems to be okay. Next up, we have what is possibly the newest of today's tested games, Call of Duty Black Ops 6 with the balanced preset. This keeps the render resolution at 100%, also upscaling remains off here. I did try the Ultra preset and we were seeing some pretty hefty dips to the mid 40s, but let's see if we can find a few enemies. There's one now. That would have been embarrassing if I literally just showed you the settings and then got wiped out by an enemy player. As you can see, at least 70 frames per second. And we've been wiped out. Now, Call of Duty is one of those games that I do find myself buying every year. I have to admit, I am one of those people because I do find them fun to play online. Plus, you know, for the sake of benchmarks as well. I like to buy them to test, see how well they run, because these games generally have a massive player base. I do think it looks pretty good. Yesterday we tested this without a graphics card and it was quite interesting to see just how bad it could look with the absolute lowest of the low settings. The contrast between the absolute lowest and the absolute highest is massive in this game, and I think it's one of the biggest differences that I see. You get a lot of games these days where switching to low doesn't actually look like low in comparison to ultra. The difference can be negligible, but with this, low settings, well, you know you're at low settings, let's say that. The difference can be massive, especially the texture work sometimes. It can look really horrendous. Just almost blew myself up with a grenade there, and surely I'm about to get wiped out yet again. So, yeah, let's move on. We are back in Cyberpunk 2077 now, 1440p. Of course, the preset says custom, but this was basically the medium preset with crowd density set to high. The textures were also kept at medium here. I think this gives us a really nice balance between performance and visuals. The game looks pretty good at medium, as you'll soon see. The difference between ray tracing on and off is of course massive. I wouldn't go any higher than this if you plan on playing at 1440p native with a 3060 Ti in 2024. I'm just going to borrow this car now, go for a little drive, and see how this impacts frame rate. Sorry, these guys just keep appearing from every time. I think I must load at the same checkpoint when these guys are just behind me or something, because every time I load up, there they are waiting to open fire, and sure enough they cause me to crash or something. But let's see if we can escape. This is actually pretty good for our benchmark testing because it's going to take its toll on the performance. As you can see here, still hitting just above 60 FPS. I think I did a pretty good job of guessing some of the visual settings and the presets that we need to use in order to hit at least 60 frames per second. Running pretty well on this card, at least 60 FPS, which is what we wanted, and it still looks great at medium too, with the high crowds of course to give Night City a little more life. As you may expect, Counter-Strike 2 had no issues. I actually went with the high preset. This will turn MSAA on. I've just seen myself get wiped out in the background while adjusting the settings there. FX Super Resolution, or FSR, will also be disabled at this preset by default, and we don't need to enable it here for at least, well, what is 300 FPS a lot of the time. But once again, the exact averages will be up on screen. I'm pretty useless at this. I mean, I can fire a whole, I don't know, what's a clip, I guess, into someone, and then I still get wiped out. It's like my guns do no damage or something. Maybe I'm just terrible at aiming, but performance-wise, pretty good. Pretty happy with how it's running here. Elden Ring is capped at 60 FPS, as you know. I guess this is for the sake of the engine, but I don't tend to uncap it because I don't want disastrous things to happen. What I do, however, is depth of field. Such an immature joke. Depth of field and motion blur are turned off because, as you know, I do not like either of those two options. I'm going for a little wander around this grassy area here. Not much going on. A lot of wind on screen, it would seem. I haven't really progressed that far in the game on PC. I have played quite a bit of it on the PlayStation, however. You wouldn't think so because I am still quite terrible at it. But whoa! Okay. I was not expecting that. I'm going to have to walk away in a minute. That made me jump. At least the game is still running with a solid 60 frames per second, but I didn't doubt the 3060 Ti in this one for a second with these settings. It looks great and runs really nicely as well. Next up, we have Fortnite. Now, if we jump into the settings here, we are using DX12. I did set this to the high preset, but then I also drag that resolution slider up to 100%. Nanite will also turn on, and so will Lumen by default if we choose the high preset and leave everything as it is. But this really does have a severe impact on our frame rate. We were seeing less than 50 frames per second at this native resolution with 100% scaling with Nanite and Lumen enabled. So I turned these off. Of course, you could probably enable Nanite and Lumen at 1080p and see at least 60 frames per second. When you've got a card that is capable of hitting at least 60 FPS and providing half decent visuals, you may as well push it a little harder, and that's what I've done here. Helldivers 2 up next, 1440p, and I decided to opt for the native render scale, of course, with the high graphics preset. Nothing else was really changed. I was surprised to see this one running quite well, considering when you first start off in like your spaceship thing at the start, the frame rate can be a bit all over the place and you think this is going to run absolutely terribly. But when we jump into the game, as you can see here, it is hitting at least 60 FPS and it will maintain this as well. So Helldivers 2 is definitely playable on the 3060 Ti at 1440p in 2024. I can't play this one for too long because these little alien things absolutely creep me out. I won't even lie, it's like when I played Resident Evil for the first time and I ended up switching my PS2 off because the monsters in that just creep me out, and the same is going on here. The more these things run at me, the more nightmares I'm going to have tonight. So I'll keep this benchmark brief because these things genuinely do scare me. What doesn't scare me though is the performance, because that is nice and smooth with decent percentile lows as well. Once Human up next, I don't often find myself playing this, but it is within Steam's most played games, so I figured a lot of you would want to see how it runs. I actually stuck with DX11 for this one, went with the high graphical preset with 100% render scaling. I decided to take on the guys outside this little hut here. As you can see, performance is holding pretty steady. I think we could have gone a little bit higher in terms of the visuals. I don't remember the bloke here running around in his underpants before. I've yet to find some trousers for the poor fella, so I should probably make that a priority. As you can see though, frame rate wise, it's doing pretty well, over 100 FPS a lot of the time, and no issues with severe stutters or anything like that, although I think the roof just disappeared briefly there, a bit of a graphical glitch. These spiders creep me out quite a bit. We're going to leave this area here. As you can see, the 3060 Ti within my micro RTX case is getting rather warm, 80 degrees. Nothing too serious though, nothing to worry about here. I just need a bigger case or more fans, I think. The i9 is sitting back and relaxing at about 50% utilisation. So the card is definitely the limiting factor, which is what we want to see, of course, in a GPU test. For Red Dead Redemption 2, sometimes I go with the console quality settings or the Digital Foundry Xbox One X equivalent, which is ultra textures and then a mix, but I just went with ultra textures and basically everything else set to high apart from TAA, which was set to medium. This again was sort of guesswork as to thinking that we'd get at least 60 frames per second. Jumping into the game, and yeah, sure enough, in and around Valentine, it's getting pretty close to dropping under 60. 62 here, we're just going to nick this poor fella's horse. Let's take this for a ride, see if it dips below 60 frames per second here. 61, 60, yeah, 59 there. As we make our way outside of town, this definitely picks back up, so probably wouldn't recommend going much higher than this in terms of visuals for Red Dead Redemption 2 at 1440p, but Wow, that was a really quick weather change. At least 80 FPS now, and when you make your way outside of busy towns and that, your frame rate will pick up, and it's nice to see it remaining somewhat stable in busy areas too. The 3060 Ti doesn't really have much of a problem with this game, but then again, I think the card came out around about the same time as this came to PC, so I was expecting it to do well. We're going to end on perhaps one of the more troublesome games today, Starfield. I think the best thing to do here was keep things at low. Of course, no cheating, so 100% render resolution scaling, no frame gen, no FSR, any other upscaling here. And in and around Aquila here, we're getting about 60 frames per second, though it is definitely dropping lower than that. Imagine that it's going to run a little better when we sort of jump these city walls in a minute, but let's just wipe out a few pedestrians. I'm sorry you had to be the sacrifice of my benchmarking video, population of Aquila, but that's just the way it is, unfortunately. We'll make our way towards the city wall now and see if things improve much. Okay, so I'm on top of the wall, looking back over Aquila there. It does dip our frame rate a little bit, sorry mate. Jumping the walls, yeah, bumps things up to at least 70 FPS as expected, but I have found that keeping things at low, unless you want to implement some sort of upscaling here, is definitely the best thing to do. But that's just about it for our 3060 Ti benchmarks today. This card definitely still has it. If you're looking at playing at 1080p with higher settings, then it's going to be even better. It's going to be really good, in fact. Still 1440p, as you've seen, is still very much doable, though it may need a little help from DLSS or FSR in certain games, and if you want to enable ray tracing, then that's a no-brainer really as well. In terms of value for money, look out for the 6700 XT as an alternative, 12 gigs of VRAM there, and at least in the UK it's slightly less on the used market. I'm sure there are a few other options as well. I always tend to go back to like benchmarking sites, let's say TechSpot or Tech Power Up, see which cards competed closely to this in their sort of average charts, and then take a look at the prices of them now on sites like eBay to see how they compare in price, because you should still get a decent idea of how they're going to perform in relation to this thing. But let me know what you think of this one down below, what you think of the 3060 Ti in 2024, whether or not you still have one, of course. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you all next time.